Hello, everyone. Welcome to Roosevelt Institute's webinar on industrial policy, learning from industrial policy successes and failures. We're really excited to have such a great turnout for the event today, as well as a really distinguished panel that I will introduce in a minute. As with many webinars, we will be taking your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll sort of, towards the latter half of the hour that we have together, open up the conversation to audience questions. But before that, we'll have some great speakers talking about an exciting bunch of new papers that Roosevelt Institute has released over the last few weeks. So before we jump into the panel, I wanted to just offer some introductory remarks to kind of situate some of the papers that we've been putting out over the last few weeks. Definitely we're in a moment where industrial policy is back in vogue. It really never left. If you were looking at sort of the military or defense sector or pharmaceutical sector, there was always, industries that came in for privileged treatment from the government. But I think what we've seen over the course of the last few years is a real turn towards, making conscious decisions from conscious and democratic decisions of which sectors need to survive and thrive in order to promote resilience for the national economy over the longer term. And Roosevelt's been working in this space for a number of years, and I think that even ourselves have been surprised at the pace of this turn. But it's been bipartisan as well, with several big pieces of legislation, including the CHIPS and Science Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act that were passed in the first couple of years of the Biden administration. I think we're starting to see some really exciting successes and results from those investments. We're seeing manufacturing, construction, at record levels. You have to go back to sort of the Eisenhower or Roosevelt era to find such an amount of investment happening in that sector. We're seeing employment in constructions that's reaching record highs. We're seeing academic estimates that now suggest that, with the incentives of the Inflation Reduction Act, that domestic made solar and wind is now cost competitive with imports for the first time in a generation. And according to recent estimates from MIT and the Rhodium Group, we're seeing investment in clean energy up 40% relative to the pre-CHIPS IRA baseline. So this is all really exciting. And just this last week, we've also had some big announcements out of the Department of Energy that there is $6 billion going towards industrial decarbonization demonstration projects, which they're centering the use of union labor in a lot of these projects, and estimating that U.S. aluminum capacity, for instance, could double as a result of some of these investments. So that's all very exciting and good news. But there's also been some other side of the news, which is that some of these projects are facing headwinds, whether that's supply chains, interest rates, or other hurdles. Some of the projects, namely offshore wind, was the big story from last year. Have been finding it difficult to make their projects go. And so that takes us to sort of the topic of this panel, which is looking at what are some of the toolkits and strategies that the U.S. could be using over the next few years to fill in some of those gaps and address some of those headwinds, no pun intended, in the wind sector. We have three panelists that have studied different aspects of best practices internationally and domestically that are going to be sharing their insights with us today on sort of what that next piece of the industrial policy agenda could be. So I'll do the intros of our panel in the order that they'll be speaking. First up, Saleh Omarova is the Beth and Mark Goldberg Professor of Law at Cornell University and a Senior Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Her work focuses on systemic risk regulation, financial technology, and trends in global financial markets. In 2021, Professor Omarova was President Biden's nominee for the U.S. Comptroller of the Currency. Next up is Jonas Algers, who is a PhD candidate at the Division for Environmental and Energy System Studies at Lund University, where he studies the political economy of steel industry decarbonization. He has been a visiting researcher with the OECD and worked at the Norwegian think tank Manifest on green industrial policy for the oil-producing economy. And last but not least, our own Isabel Estevez. Estevez is Deputy Director of Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute, working on climate and economic transformation. She's a development economist who has served as Senior Policy Advisor for Green Industrial Policy at the Sierra Club and advised the Ecuadorian Ministry of Planning and Development, among others. And so I'll sort of tee up an initial round of questions for our panel. And we're going to sort of, the title of this is Learning from Industrial Policy Successes and Failures. And I think that we're going to start on sort of one end of that spectrum of some really encouraging successes from history and the international experience, and then maybe move over into areas where we still have some room for growth. So Sally, I'll sort of tee up each of the questions, and then we'll go around to the panel. So Sally is going to discuss things that we know work, because both the US and trading partners like Norway have done or continue to do national development banking, which is the subject of her contribution to our Industrial Policy 2025 series, Bringing the State Back In Again, which is a series of 6 essays that I encourage everyone to go read. Then we'll head to Jonas, who has also contributed an essay to that collection, to discuss Sweden, where there's an exciting all-of-government experiment around green steel that is facing both some tailwinds and headwinds that he'll talk about. And last but not least, we'll turn to Isabel, who is going to discuss her study with co-authors Heba Qasim, Young Kwan, and Ilaria Paul on Dearborn, Michigan, where the green steel transition has not yet begun. So Sally, your essay for the IP 2025 series looks at national development banking, and you produce 3 or 4 classic types of national development banking. Could you describe what each of those types are, where they're being used, and how all of this connects to industrial policy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Todd. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So financing industrial policy is not just about the amount of money to be spent. Just as important as the institutional structure through which the money flows, that determines how the capital gets allocated and how it impacts society in practice. Many countries actively use dedicated institutions of public investment to finance their industrial policy. It's a more effective approach than relying solely on general purpose government agencies that use generic fiscal policy tools and are subject to traditional political and budgetary constraints. A dedicated investment institution can be designed to have more flexibility and to carry out a more dynamic long-term strategy of economic development. My report identifies and examines 3 main institutional models currently operating in developed economies outside the United States: sovereign wealth funds, national development banks, and state holding companies. As a point of historical comparison, it also examines the 4th distinctly American model, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, which operated successfully during the Great Depression and World War II. But my main focus is on what works now. So sovereign wealth funds, these are a diverse group of special purpose, government-owned portfolio investment vehicles that can pursue a wide variety of national economic objectives. Typically, sovereign wealth funds use surplus state revenues, often from natural resource exports, to preserve and grow the nation's financial reserves by investing primarily in publicly traded foreign currency denominated securities. Among developed Western democracies, the most influential and instructive case is Norway's sovereign wealth fund, established in 1969 and funded by Norway's petroleum revenues. The fund is one of the largest and most active institutional investors in the world. It invests heavily in equities of publicly listed companies, in bonds, and also importantly in renewable energy infrastructure. As a large shareholder, the fund famously seeks to influence its portfolio companies' business decisions by exercising its corporate management rights, as well as by conditioning its investments in individual companies on ethical grounds. For example, the fund is prohibited from investing in foreign companies that commit serious violations of human rights, promote war and conflict, cause severe environmental damage, foster corruption, or otherwise violate fundamental ethical norms. Its mandate explicitly defines long-term financial return as being dependent on sustainable development in economic, environmental, and social terms. From the viewpoint of industrial policy, Norway's experience shows the potential of a sovereign wealth fund structure to serve as an institutional tool of changing economic incentives and behavior of multiple private companies in multiple sectors. The fund's greatest strength lies in the scale and scope of their investment portfolios. The bigger shareholder a sovereign wealth fund is, the more power it can exert on other companies, on the behavior of a wide range of companies through well-established corporate governance rights. An important feature of sovereign wealth funds is that they usually don't have debt liabilities, and that's why they can act as suppliers of patient capital, which is critical for transformative infrastructure projects. That makes them potentially important vehicles for domestic industrial policy implementation. Development banks are another category of public investment institutions widely used for financing industrial policy objectives. There are hundreds of public development banks currently operating in multiple countries. They differ from sovereign wealth funds in their explicitly domestic focus, more diverse sources of funding, and more diverse investment strategies. Unlike sovereign wealth funds, development banks are predominantly credit institutions. That's why they're banks rather than funds. And depending on their mandates, development banks invest in infrastructure, agricultural development, social housing, strategic export industries, and other areas prioritized by their governments. One of the most successful examples of this model is Germany's KfW, which is owned jointly by the German federal government and the German states. It was established in 1948 to manage post-war reconstruction, but currently is one of the largest publicly owned banks in the world, operating through many subsidiaries. Because the German government guarantees all of KfW's obligations, the bank enjoys a very strong credit rating and thus derives most of its funding by issuing federally guaranteed bonds in global capital markets. KfW's credit portfolio includes loans to small and medium-sized enterprises, housing-related loans, educational grants, financing for infrastructure, and other loans. But most of them are extended in partnership with Germany's public and private commercial banks. In that sense, KfW is a bank's bank. But KfW also makes strategic equity investments in various sectors and regions in accordance with government priorities. It's always been a potent tool of Germany's industrial policy. In recent years, it's been at the center of the Germany's efforts to deal with the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. KfW also plays a central role in financing Germany's long-term energy sufficiency policies, which illustrates the greater potential of a national development bank model to finance government's industrial policy priorities. Nevertheless, development banks remain primarily lending institutions, and they often raise capital by issuing debt. Both of these institutional features limit, potentially, development banks' abilities to channel capital into riskier but more transformative projects that require equity funding. And this is where the third category of institutions of public investment comes into play, the state holding company. That can serve as a much more direct and assertive instrument of industrial policy than a development bank. Singapore's Temasek Holdings Limited is an example of a modern-day state holding company operating as a public asset manager and venture capital firm. It was incorporated in 1974 to manage Singapore's public funds on behalf of Ministry of Finance. It's an active investor in domestic and foreign equities. With the recent shift toward private equity investments, Temasek forms and manages investment funds, joint ventures, partnerships. It holds controlling equity stakes in Singapore sectoral champions, such as Singapore Airlines, but its investment strategies are not limited to specific sectors. It's an active investor focusing on big structural trends like sustainability and technological innovation. Importantly, Temasek financing includes various social services and providing public goods to communities, which came in really handy during the COVID pandemic. Temasek's strong credit rating enables it to issue long-term bonds and commercial paper to finance activities. It also relies on its portfolio revenues and its ability to borrow directly from the Ministry of Finance. In short, as this example shows, the state holding company model offers even more flexibility in pursuit of ambitious industrial policy goals. Unlike development banks, state holding companies are not limited mainly to lending, and unlike sovereign wealth funds, state holding companies can make private equity investments and take controlling stakes in strategically important domestic companies. That flexibility, however, heightens the need to ensure effective governance and democratic accountability of a state holding company, which is a vital element of designing any institution of public investment. So to sum up, these three examples of contemporary institutions successfully financing developmental goals are highly relevant to our ongoing debate on new US industrial policy. Since the dissolution of the RFC in 1951, the US has not had a federal level development bank, and we sorely need one. While directly replicating a specific country's approach is neither realistic nor desirable, their experiences are a vital source of learning for all of us.
Thanks, Ale. That's so informative and so interesting, and really gives one hope that there are some great models out there to learn from as the US thinks about the next phase of its industrial policy work. Jonas, I want to turn to you. You know, Sweden's the envy of the world for a lot of the progress that you've been making on green steel. Could you walk us through the history of how Sweden set steel decarbonization as a goal, and what are the different policy levers that the government is using to bring that to bear?
Absolutely. Thank you, Todd, and thank you very much for having me here today to discuss this. Let me just first start off by mentioning, what is steel decarbonization briefly. So steel contributes today close to about 10% of global emissions. And this is mainly because the use of coal in what's called the iron reduction process. So first you have to mine the iron ore, and then you have to reduce it into iron, and then you have to turn the iron into steel. And the plan is to shift from adding carbon in the iron reduction process, which produces CO2, to add hydrogen, which produces H2O, or water vapor. So, however, industrial transitions are very difficult and complex. You have very long investment cycles, very large and costly investments, and strong lock-in effects from established value chains. So Sweden has been able to get no less than 2 projects off the ground. And the purpose of this piece is to look at the role of industrial policy in making that happen. So the 2 projects are, one is Hybrid, which is a joint venture with SSAB, a steelmaker, LKAB, a miner, and Vattenfall, which is a utility. And the other project is H2 Green Steel, which, and these 2 have some of the most ambitious timelines in the world. And SSAB's decarbonization plan alone will lower Swedish emissions by about 10%. So it's a significant contribution to emission reductions. And H2 Green Steel plans to crowd out a similar amount of emissions abroad. And in addition to that, LKAB, the miner, it produces about 80% of the iron ore in the European Union. And its plans will remove an equivalent to Sweden's total territorial emissions, about 40 to 50 million tons per annum of CO2, in the value chain of companies also outside Sweden. So significant emission reductions, but also huge investments. So SSAB will invest about $5 billion. H2 Green Steel was the largest private capital placement in Europe last year. And LKAB will invest about $40 billion over 20 years, according to their plans. So very large projects for a relatively small country. And in this piece, I identify 4 what we can call policy pillars that enable this transition. And the first one relates to directionality. And that's something that often comes up in the literature around industrial transitions, because you need directionality that points to a clear path forward for the entire industry to sort of coalesce around. And Parliament passed a bill to reach net zero by 2045, about close to 10 years ago. And this was also institutionalized in what was called the Fossil-Free Sweden program, where each sector had to coalesce around a common plan to decarbonize their sector. And this formalized sort of state-business relationship in a way that the government set the target, and then businesses could independently work on how to reach that target. And this pushed companies to deliver emission reductions, and in this process, coordinate on a path and find key points where with high risk in the transition, and then go to the government and ask for necessary interventions to manage that risk. And this leads me to the second policy pillar, which is de-risking and risk-taking. And this is also something you have in the United States, of course. So in Sweden, the government established a program for industrial decarbonization to fund and support research and pre-feasibility studies and piloting. However, the government has also been willing to take on risk in the demonstration and deployment stage. So we have the everywhere from the EU's innovation fund, sort of on the higher level, but also the Swedish National Debt Office has given credit guarantees, green credit guarantees for some of these projects. We also had loans from the Export Credit Agency and the Industrial Decarbonization Program I just mentioned, which is governed by the Energy Authority, have also given a grant of about $300 million to LKAB for their demonstration plant. So that's the second pillar. And the third, which I think needs to be mentioned and is rarely pointed out in discussions around Swedish decarbonization, is that there's significant state ownership also playing a role here. So the Swedish state owns 100% of LKAB and Vattenfall, and LKAB in turn is the largest shareholder in SSAB. So the Swedish government has not in any way directed the companies to use a specific technology or develop their business models based on any political preferences. However, state ownership has meant that these companies could think long-term about decarbonization and innovation rather than maximizing shareholder value in the short term. And in addition, the government could support LKAB's transition by lowering the expected dividends from the company to be paid out to the government, because that's decided by the government, right? And then the final policy pillar I want to highlight is competition. So the industrial policy programs have been open for any relevant applicant, which opened up for the startup H2 Green Steel to join the race as well. So they've also been able to apply for and receive credit guarantees and various forms of support. And H2 Green Steel is a startup, so they're much more in a rush to get their revenue stream up and running, and therefore had launched with a very ambitious timeline. And very soon after H2 Green Steel was launched, SSAB also moved forward their transition to 2030 from 2045, so 15 years before the initial targets. So I think having two companies has been very important to put speed at the heart of the process. So to conclude, de-risking has only been part of the Swedish policy mix, and institutionalized directionality and state ownership has also been part of the puzzle to enable long-term innovation. And I believe these are some key pillars that I think policymakers should consider when developing the next steps in American industrial policy. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonas. That's so interesting and really, again, sort of another inspiring case study. Isabel, I want to turn to you. You and your co-authors zero in on a single community and a single steel facility or facilities in Dearborn, Michigan, where the transition to green steel has really yet to take off. In your paper, you identify 4 factors, that are affecting holdup on the progress there. Could you walk us through what those are and the other conclusions of your paper?
Thank you, Todd. Yes, absolutely. So the purpose of our study was to examine the political economy of steel decarbonization in the US, but zoning in on Dearborn, Michigan as a case study. And that means that the facility that we focus on is Dearborn's last remaining steel facility, which is called Dearborn Works. And that was a facility originally built by Ford as part of his automotive steelmaking vertically integrated complex more than a century ago, and it's now owned by Cleveland-Cliffs, the steel giant. And as many of you know, on Monday, the Department of Energy announced that Cleveland-Cliffs will be one of the recipients of up to $575 million of IRA decarbonization funds. But those funds are not going to Dearborn. They're going primarily to Middletown, Ohio, where Cliffs will be replacing a coal-based facility with a hydrogen-ready flex fuel furnace. That's the details of which are not completely clear yet. But what that means for places like Dearborn that have not received decarbonization investments is that the workers that are at the coal-based Dearborn Works facility remain kind of stuck in this limbo of not knowing if they'll have the chance to transition to modern green steel production, or whether their facility is going to succumb to the kind of trend toward deindustrialization that Midwestern communities have been grappling with for decades. So just 3 years ago, Dearborn already lost Great Lakes Steel, a US steel-owned facility, and that almost cut in half the number of local steel jobs. And the prospect of losing Dearborn Works would mean losing the remaining 1,300 steel jobs in the community and the tax base that comes with that. So turning that fear of further job loss and economic insecurity into an opportunity for job retention through decarbonization is one of the challenges that we discuss in the report. And we draw on the work of the Ohio River Valley Institute, which has studied the economic opportunities that lie in pursuing a green steel transition as a means of keeping the industry alive. But for those opportunities to materialize, there are certain challenges that had to be overcome. And the first is obviously the willingness of steel companies to commit to investing in green steel. We've seen the beginnings of those commitments starting this week, led by public sector initiative. But there has really been a longstanding reluctance from US steel companies to make green transition commitments, and they've been lagging far behind European competitors, like our friends in Sweden. So before this week, what we had seen in the US is really minor investments and minor tweaks that companies like Cleveland-Cliffs have nonetheless managed to leverage to charge green premiums, while at the same time spending several hundreds of millions of dollars on aggressive share buyback agendas. And in Cliffs' case, that was all the while boasting about its historic levels of liquidity that right now are about 4.5 billion. So this kind of profit-seeking corporate inertia that Jonas was also alluding to in the US is really the main obstacle that we see, and it's the main obstacle that we highlight in the report. And what we argue for is stronger coordination between governments, workers, and communities to break that corporate path dependency through various means, which I can get into later. Another major challenge that we highlight is a supply chain challenge, namely the construction of green hydrogen capacity, which is the indispensable input for green steel. Green hydrogen is a very energy-hungry product. It depends on the availability of abundant renewable energy. And as we all know, that's currently in very short supply. So unless renewable energy capacity, the gap in renewable energy capacity is addressed, we can't have green hydrogen and we can't have green steel. And that's why it's been so heartening to see that one of Monday's announcements includes a green hydrogen-based facility, courtesy of our friends in Sweden, which currently is now showing that it's not impossible to solve the green hydrogen bottleneck. And that calls into question other steel decarbonization methods that use natural gas or natural gas plus carbon capture and storage instead of green hydrogen, which connects to the final challenge that we highlight in the report that has to do with the very legitimate community fears that some proposed green steel transitions may not be all that green. So many communities are actively opposed to the use of technologies like carbon capture and storage because of concerns about its environmental and health impacts, and because even if one manages to trap pollutants in hydrogen production, that still doesn't address the environmental and health pollution and impacts of expanding natural gas production to make hydrogen. And so in communities like Dearborn, we've seen many past disappointments with the enforcement of pollution controls, environmental injustice, zoning decisions that led to polluting facilities being sited immediately next to people's homes, immediately next to schools, and general failures to keep industry accountable to the community. So the trauma from that is very much alive. And as we're seeing now with some of the initial reactions to Monday's announcements for the decarbonization grants, some groups are less than thrilled about public money being used for carbon capture and storage, and they're also very watchful to see whether Cleveland-Cliffs' new facility in Ohio is going to commit to using green hydrogen, which would mean green steel. So for governments, what this all means is, I think, is that the best way to avoid sowing mistrust and the best way to win support from environmental justice communities in a way that builds momentum for more industrial decarbonization is to make sure that green steel investments are in fact green. And that means either using the existing industrial policy toolkit to both press and support private companies to achieve decarbonization, or exploring options like nationalization or the creation of public enterprises along the lines of what Sweden has to build the productive capacity that's needed for the green transition.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel. That was really interesting. Audience, start preparing your questions because we're going to be turning to you very shortly. And you can, again, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to get those questions ready. I want to sort of do a rapid round for the whole panel to look at sort of, we've sort of talked about where we've come from. I want to talk a little bit about where we're going or where we need to be going to making more progress. So Saleh, as we mentioned earlier, you're the architect and author of an ambitious proposal, the National Investment Authority, which would revive and expand aspects of the Roosevelt-era Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I'd love you to just say a few words about that proposal and how you think it might help solve some of the bottlenecks that we're seeing now in industrial policy. Jonas, you've just come out of some time at the OECD in Paris, and I know that you followed pretty closely some of the US, EU, and kind of international discussions around green steel cooperation. Like, what do you think are some of both the low-hanging fruit and some of the things we should be focusing on in those in international cooperation around green steel? And then Isabel, you've mentioned some of the developments even just this week when it comes to cleaner steel. What are some of the, when you're talking to groups either in Dearborn or nationally, what do folks see as sort of like the missing policy toolkit that we need to be developing, in the coming sessions of Congress, say, or even at the local level, that would really sort of help communities like Dearborn make the transition that they've made, or that they should be making? Saleh, I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. So my National Investment Authority, or NIA, proposal is directly inspired by the RFC experience as a distinctive US historical precedent and builds on the existing models, especially development banks and state holding companies, but takes them to the next level by deliberately combining three unique features: much bigger scale, coordination capabilities, and greater flexibility of tools and activities. I envision the NIA not as a single bank or a fund, but as an institutional platform for designing, financing, and implementing nationwide developmental policy initiatives. Its proposed structure enables coordinated public action in multiple markets through multiple channels. The NIA is meant to be a lender, a shareholder, and an asset manager, depending on what works best in any particular case. For example, one NIA subsidiary, the National Infrastructure Bank, would focus on credit-based financing of industrial policy priorities through loans, guarantees, securitizations, and secondary market making. It would function as a modified version of a national development bank, but with a broader set of tools applied at a deliberately larger scale and in coordination with other NIA activities. A separate NIA subsidiary, the National Capital Management Corporation, NICI-MAC, would specialize in equity-based finance, mainly of high-risk structural priorities. It would function as a publicly owned asset manager, a sort of publicly owned BlackRock, setting up multiple investment funds and soliciting pension funds, endowments, and other potentially patient institutional investors to purchase passive equity stakes as limited partners in these funds. As the sole general partner, NICI-MAC would select and manage, with appropriate public input and oversight, individual funds' portfolios of equity investments in advanced clean technology, critical infrastructure, and so on and so forth. In effect, NICI-MAC would augment the traditional stakeholding company model's active investment management approach. For example, NICI-MAC could establish joint ventures with private companies in various strategic industries to help overcome specific coordination problems or incentive misalignments of the kind described by Isabel. It could invest in supporting infrastructures for green steel industry, for instance, and thereby create new jobs for the local populations, approaching these problems in an integrated way and with a focus on the macro level policy goals, which private companies do not and often simply cannot do. Both as an equity investor and as a lender, the NIA could set new market standards in technology, labor relations, environmental standards, and other matters. Where appropriate, it could also invest in the public provision of specific goods and services, and so forth. So this flexibility, scale, and ability to exercise control over the deployment of capital are crucial factors that would allow the NIA to manage the transition to a more resilient, sustainable, and democratic economy. Of course, the actual proposal is a lot more complex and has a lot more details, but this is the most important part I would like to convey to you today.
Jonas,
Great.
send it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think it's a really good question, and it's a difficult one because I think there are so many initiatives right now going on in regards to decarbonizing or cooperating internationally on decarbonizing steel. But I think the two domestic approaches to steel decarbonization in the US and the EU are quite different. The EU primarily focuses on, the EU ETS and raising the cost of fossil-based steelmaking, while the US is focusing on lowering the cost of clean steelmaking. Sweden, I would say, is an exception to this in the study. And SSAB, as we know, earlier this week has now established in the US, and people are very concerned about the industry leaving the EU to the US. So this is quite a sensitive topic. And in a way, I'm quite, at the moment, pessimistic about the prospects for bilateral EU-US negotiations, because we have both US and EU elections coming up. Very difficult year to have any sort of international. I mean, all the Washington and Brussels are focused on their domestic issues rather than international issues. So I think we'll have to see what's politically possible after that. But I think we need to remember that there are very complex elements of a green steel trade agreement, and very significant differences as well in how the steel industries are set up. Is it really fair to say that US steel makers should get a head start simply because of the large availability of scrap and scrap-based steelmaking with lower emissions compared to the EU? And on the other hand, I would say to European negotiators, is it really politically realistic to introduce carbon taxes on dirty steel when carbon taxes have been tried and failed for quite some time now in the US, with even a far less radicalized Republican Party? So I think perhaps it will be useful to reorient discussions on the elements that can be agreed upon. And I think that will be that we need to transition dirty primary steelmaking into clean steelmaking, the basics. And I think international cooperation through a climate club format is where I'm more optimistic. For example, the OECD's climate club, the Lead It initiative, rather than a trade agreement as such. And I think, you could have a climate club or a transition club where countries commit to closing or transitioning a share of dirty steel capacity by a certain year, either by subsidizing a transition or by taxing emissions. There can be some policy flexibility there. And then the benefit would be to get some sort of trade access. If this is given as a percentage of primary steel, then the scrap pool will not give a head start and everyone will be on equal footing. So I think, we need to reorient the sort of ambitions a bit from a sort of general trade agreement to more a climate club approach. Yeah.
Isabel.
Yes. Thanks a lot for that question, Todd. I think it really raises a fundamental issue about what is the scale of investment that's needed for steel decarbonization and where those resources can come from. I think that the Department of Energy's own estimates say that we need about $1 trillion to decarbonize heavy industry. So the 20 billion that was announced on Monday between the 6 billion from the Department of Energy and 14 billion in private investment is just a small fraction of what's needed. And in terms of direct support for industrial decarbonization, we're still lagging behind Europe. Public Citizen and Industrialist Labs have actually highlighted that Europe's subsidies for industrial decarb demonstrations are about 35% lower than in the EU. And all of that is to say that more investments are definitely needed. So I very much hear that argument. But at the same time, that investment can also come from many different sources. And one of those sources could be the enormous liquidity that companies like Cleveland-Cliffs are currently holding and using for things like share buybacks, which economists like Lenore Palladino have long argued should be prescribed when companies are receiving public investment. So especially given that it may take some time for Congress to create public funds, to create new public funds for decarbonization investments, I think it would make a lot of sense to find ways to induce private investment through other industrial policy measures. And some of the tools that we cover in the report are things like more extensive use of the Defense Production Act, which Todd, you've written about, more aggressive use of buy clean procurement policies, obviously trade policy measures, and importantly, stronger use of executive regulatory action on industrial pollutants. That's a major health concern for Dearborn. Cancer, asthma, lead poisoning, all the typical diseases related to industrial pollution are a huge problem in Dearborn. And we detail those health impacts in the report with testimony from the community. And finally, we also talk about the potential of piecing together funds from some of the other major Inflation Reduction Act programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. There are lots of pools of money that can be pieced together for more decarbonization investments. And as I already alluded to, we also talk about measures like nationalization, creation of public steel enterprises, or even the creation of worker-owned steel companies to think a bit outside the box about how we can solve that problem of misallocation that arises when public companies have to prioritize profits and shareholder value over public interest. And I think there we can really learn a lot from historical and comparative experiences. The US has a very long track record of public ownership and nationalization, including in the steel sector. And internationally, many steel producers today are state-owned companies because countries see steel as a strategic sector that's too important to be left exclusively to private management. So I think about 22 of the world's largest 100 steel companies are directly or indirectly owned by states, and they produce about 32% of global crude steel output. And as Jonas has shown, state ownership in Sweden has been a key enabler of its leadership in iron and steel decarbonization. And now with Monday's announcement, I think it's interesting to say that we can also say that state ownership of steel in Sweden has been a key enabler of US efforts to catch up in the green steel transition. So I think that's a really important lesson for us to digest. So those are just some of the possible policy tools that we can potentially use to accelerate a green steel transition. And to answer the second part of your question, Todd, they would really bring enormous health and economic benefits to a community like Dearborn. Residents there have been advocating for many decades to address toxic pollution, and they want to do that while preserving steel jobs in their communities by modernizing the industry to bring it to the technological frontier. So a faster green steel transition is really a win-win proposition for workers and for communities. And what we show in the report is that we do have the policy toolkit to make that happen much faster.
That's great. All right, our audience has stepped in and has a lot of great questions for our panel. So we'll take one round of these now that I'll read off. Sally, I want to kick a question from Leopold to you, who asked how the team working on implementation of chips at the U.S. Department of Commerce could adopt some of the finance principles that you support. I mean, in other words, to maybe take this a bit broader, what are some of the ideas and notions that you explore in your various case studies that could be sort of taken off the shelf to actually execute, now by programs that the Biden administration is trying to do. I want to take the question from Sue Helper for Jonas. How does Sweden exercise its ownership rights in steel? How are the board members appointed? What instructions are they given? Are there safeguards against graft, etc.? Thanks. And then Isabel, we have a question, a variety of questions from Mark Cassell, who ask about sub-federal policy institutions and wondering whether there's, whether you've looked at things like community development financial institutions or sort of other policies that either Michigan or other states are pursuing. So we'll take that round of questions, and if there's time, we'll go for another round. And I will start. Who wants to go first? Sally, you ready to go?
Well, I guess so. Well, it's a great question, Leopold, and it's hard to kind of give a specific set of principles for the Department of Commerce to implement as of today, because the Department of Commerce is not a development bank. It's not a sovereign wealth fund. It has its own sort of set of constraints under which it operates. But I think the most important principle that they should take into account is that it is critical to use the money that Congress has allocated so far and given to the Department of Commerce to sort of set in motion a more resilient, longer-term institutional channel through which certain democratic decisions can be implemented into economic realities. It's important for them to think about using, for example, their loans and grants alongside perhaps certain equity-like investments to the extent that their mandate allows them to do it, and try to experiment on a small scale with some of the money to go into this direction.
Jonas.
Right, thanks. Yeah, good question. So the state, yes, appoints board members and the chair of the board, the head of the board in LKAB and Vattenfall, the companies it owns, and it does that on over a certain amount of years. I can't remember right now, perhaps it's 6 years or something like that. I also want to point out that we also have worker representation in our boards for these two companies. So 2 board members are worker appointed. And then on the instruction, yes, the companies are given instructions. Every other year or so, the government publishes its state-owned company report, where it clearly states in a transparent way what are the objectives for the companies. And for these companies, it's about running the companies on a commercial basis, but accounting for other issues such as environmental sustainability, lowering emissions, pollutants in the local environment. I know LKAB a couple of years ago was encouraged to increase the number of women employed and also represented in management in the company. So there are different kinds of instructions in that way. Yeah, when it comes on to protection from graft, or if the government appoints someone to the board just for any specific interest, I mean, there are no, what I'm aware of, there are no formal sort of regulations around that, but I think it will be very politically difficult for a government to just say, oh, we're going to introduce this person, because then next year you're sort of breaking a rule or an agreement between the opposition or the left and the right. So I don't think that will be politically sustainable, but who knows? I mean, we'll see in the future.
Isabel.
Sorry about that. Yes, lots of, really, really interesting questions. And I think there's fodder there for long discussions and lots of panels about this. But I think since it is unfortunate that we don't have an institution like the NIA that could centralize and provide a hub for leading these kinds of investments. But at the same time, the fact that we don't have an NIA does mean that there is opportunity for a lot of local leadership. So some of the instruments that were mentioned, like using CDFIs or localized public banks, I think are an enormous opportunity to do some of the things that we discuss in the report. And all it really takes, I think, is a little bit of leadership, a little bit of local leadership from whoever is running the banks or whoever is running the Economic Development Corporation in different localities, or from the mayor. I mean, it really, if there's some willingness to take some leadership on steel decarbonization projects, I think it's quite feasible to then take local proposals to the state level and to the national level and to try to piece together some of these currently scattered pots of money that are lying around that can be used for investments like steel decarbonization. So I think there's definitely, it would be really great to see people looking into the specific role that specific banks, public banks in different localities can play in all of this. And to start those discussions, because I think they could really trigger this kind of coordination between different social actors and leadership coming from that could translate into resourcing of decarbonization initiatives, which, as we also highlight in the report, would also benefit from being embedded in broader economic revitalization and development plans. So I think also finding ways to piece together local visions for economic development on a case-by-case basis in local communities, and then taking those to state, local, and national entities to fund local development is something that we need to think about a lot more. And I'm interested to see if some of the availability of these funds sparks that kind of bottom-up development planning that incorporates things like industrial decarbonization, but also much more.
Yeah, that's great. And I think even with the announcements earlier this week, there's talk about sort of how states like Kentucky, for instance, can also sort of be partners in some of the aluminum investments that are happening. I want to take another round of questions. We have some great ones. Trevor Dolan asked, for Isabel, but I think other folks should feel free to weigh in as well. Have you seen any discussion of policy solutions for worker retention in facilities that are decarbonizing, and I think that may have implications for process and equipment? We have a question from Kevin Fabrizio on how do we take antitrust into account when we're setting up these programs? And I think a number of you have weighed in on some of like the pro-competition, like a pro-competition version of industrial policy. And then in the chat, Alice Pigeon asked, how can green public procurement be integrated into industrial policy to accelerate decarbonization? So I'll let sort of whoever wants to answer any of those questions go first.
I could take it first stab. So on the worker retention question, there's a report that we reference in our report from Synapse Energy Economics that talks about this a little bit, more in cautionary terms. So about the importance of embedding retraining as part of these decarbonization investments, so as to ensure that you have a seamless transition. But I think there's also some work on that in the Ohio River Valley Institute report that we reference in our piece. It's not an area where I'm an expert, but there are people thinking about this, and I think it's a really critical discussion. And on the role of procurement, so the Biden administration already has a Buy Clean green procurement program, and it is primarily focused on heavy industry products, including steel. So I think there is room for expanding that. Right now, the way it works is obviously just give preferential treatment in procurement for products that meet certain environmental requirements. But as Todd has written about, that can be made much more ambitious using things like advanced market commitments, where you're ensuring a high level of demand from the public sector for these products, provided that they meet high environmental standards. That's one of the opportunities that we highlight as an area for growth. But it's definitely not going to do, it's not sufficient. Procurement is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not going to be sufficient to induce these kinds of investments and transitions. And on the role of antitrust, I mean, all I would say is it is a problem that we have so few companies in this space. And you see that just in the fact that they're able to have such enormous levels of profitability and to do such enormous levels of share buybacks. So I think more competition would be very welcome. And that's why things like creating new companies, including public companies, I think could be very helpful to dealing with that challenge.
Sure. I'll try and answer as well. Just very briefly on public procurement. I mean, I noticed that SSAB pointed out that they will produce steels with offshore wind grades in their project announcement, and I think offshore wind is an area absolutely where you know public procurement can play a key role. I know that's the case in Europe, in many countries, that the government wants to request green steel to be used when building offshore wind turbines, because you require a lot of steel, and that's a way an area where steel demand will be quite large in the future. So I think thinking about that could be important. And then when it comes to antitrust, I also want to highlight in a way that in discussions around the Nippon deal with the sale of US steel, that's now been nixed by the government, and it looks like perhaps Cleveland-Cliffs could be an interested buyer. I think it's important to think about ensuring competition for the assets that or in the markets that US Steel operates, because US Steel is not only a steel maker, it's also a miner. The US Steel is one of the largest producers of iron in the United States. They recently launched a program to develop what's called DR grade iron ore, which is a type of iron that's necessary for green steel, and it's in very short supply. And I think it's important to make sure that iron ore is being used for decarbonization purposes, and it's not, you know, owned by a company that then has all the time in the world to decarbonize as quickly as they want, rather than what's needed. So I think yeah, it will be important to make sure that there are several companies in the space that can compete. Yeah.
Sally, there was a question that I think maybe is very appropriate for you. The anonymous attendee asked, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of the 3 buckets of investment vehicles that you've studied, given that they're trying to do so many things at once? And with that, I'll also sort of open up for our panel to kind of give any additional sort of final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with today. So we'll start with Sally, then go to Jonas, then Isabel for that.
Yeah, that's a great question, methodologically and substantively. Of course, the point of my report, my research in this field, is not to necessarily advocate or endorse or even evaluate, like from a substantive perspective. For example, could KfW do better? What did it do right? What did it do wrong? You're absolutely right. The point of the analysis is that these institutions, these particular models of institutions, have the ability to pursue any set of specific substantive goals that their governments actually set for them. And that is what makes it difficult to compare them side by side, because those governments set different goals at different periods for different reasons. But it also precisely what makes them so valuable for the ability to dynamically adjust industrial policy, because conditions change. And we don't want these institutions to be basically stuck in what they do. We basically need to define the substantive goals for any kind of developmental institutional industrial policy financing institutions that we set up, and then ensure that they have sufficient financing and the right kind of financing not to hamper its ability to deliver the results we need, and then ensure that they actually have effective governance and accountability. Then we can assess their effectiveness against the substantive goals that we define for them.
Jonas, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So I think what's key here, or my key message is, how do we make sure that the entire value chain moves in the right direction? You know, when we saw the Cleveland Cliff announcements, they said it depends when we get access to enough hydrogen. We need to make sure that there's power, iron, and steel makers are moving in the right direction. And this is a coordination issue. So how can we make sure that we coordinate different actors along the value chain? And I think that can actually be important in lowering the total cost, right? I mean, if you have an effective coordination, perhaps subsidies or government intervention may not have to be as forceful as they otherwise would have been, as is the case with LKAB. So I think let's try to think more about coordination and less about the headline and figures for industrial policy. Yeah, thank you.
Isabel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, and kind of along the same lines, I think the main takeaway that I want to leave you with is that when you look at the empirics, I think it's pretty clear that a green steel transition, a faster green steel transition, is a win-win-win proposition for workers, for communities, obviously, and also for the longevity of the U.S. steel industry, because it means more modern, internationally competitive technologies that can reverse deindustrialization, support the tax base, and it means cleaner air, soil, and water, which is better community health. So what I hope is that the work that we've shared here today also kind of serves as a provocation for all of us to think outside the box about how governments, workers, communities, advocates can kind of better coordinate, better collaborate to kind of create a countervailing force to corporate inertia and expedite the green transition.
All right, everyone. Thank you for your participation today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for spending some of your time with us. Please stay tuned for future Roosevelt Institute webinars. We've got one coming up on preserving the administrative state, threats to administrative law and enforcement in the courts. That's going to be coming up on April 9th. And then on April 18th, we'll have tax policy as competition policy, reimagining how the U.S. tax code can foster a more equitable and participatory economy. So thank you for joining us, and look forward to you joining us in the future for future webinars. Thank you.